believe it or not, there are still reports where companies will say they cannot find qualified women. And that's just not true.
My name is Laurie Baedke. I'm an educator, a speaker, an author, and an advisor. I am passionate about equipping and encouraging others to grow and thrive in their personal lives and professional careers. This podcast shares the habits and practices of peak performers and top leaders from many walks of life: physicians, senior executives, entrepreneurs, and academics. And from every season, from the seasoned and sage to those emerging leaders and rising rock stars, all who are blazing trails and shining a light for others.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Growth Edge Leadership Podcast. Today is episode 2, part 2 in a series with the remarkable Christine Spadafor. If you did not catch her episode last week, hit pause, go back, download it and listen in. It's brilliant, but I definitely needed to have a little bit more time with Christine to explore a lot of the wisdom that she has around several important topics. By way of quick overview, here's a little bit of Christine's career portfolio. She's a management consultant, she's a lawyer, she's a board member and a speaker. She is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Harvard School of Public Health. She has a fascinating bit of extracurricular work that makes up the patchwork of her career. She's a lecturer in the Visiting Executive Program at Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business, lends her knowledge and expertise in 4 separate schools at Harvard University, in the School of Public Health, in the business school, in the law school, and in the medical school. She is a BBC commentator. And some of the most important work that she does, and a topic that I'm really excited to dig into today, she's a very active board member. She serves on the board of directors for a publicly traded company, Boyd Gaming Corporation. She's newly appointed to the board of directors of New Kindred at Home, where she's the chair of the Compliance and Quality Committee. I can't wait to explore more ground with you, Christine. But welcome. Let me stop talking and let me welcome you to the show and have you introduce yourself briefly to the listener.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about board service, a great passion of mine. I have taken the longest distance between 2 points for my career, and it is considered, I would think, sort of a mosaic or a portfolio career. As you mentioned, Laurie, just a number of great opportunities and adventures along the journey, starting with as an ICU nurse at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and then basically from the bedside to the boardroom, with stops at law school and the public health school and law firms, and then Boston Consulting Group, and then ultimately starting my own management consulting group more than 15 years ago. So it has been an interesting and joyful journey.
That is amazing. And congratulations. This most recent board appointment is exciting. You've been appointed their chair of the Compliance and Quality Committee. How did this all come about? Can you give a little bit of an overview of your foray into serving on boards of directors for the listener who might not have had that opportunity yet in their career?
My opportunities for boards came in what one might think is a somewhat unconventional way. When you think about, there are all these recruiting firms that boards typically hire for board vacancies. I did not go through recruiting firms. My 2 boards were both through networking. And I know that's a topic that women discuss a lot. We talk about how men have these strong networks and we need to develop our stronger networks. Both of my board positions were through networking. The message I would have for the listener, anyone who might be interested in securing a board seat, is one thing to remember is that someone is always watching. And here's what I mean by that. My first board seat came about from my giving a luncheon lecture to a business group. There was a person in the audience who heard me speak. He is friends with the chairman of the board. He called him up and he said, I just heard this woman speak at lunch, and I know you're looking for a board member, and I know you've got your process underway, but I really think you should talk to her. And in fact, for that first board seat at Boyd, there was a process underway. And I came in late to the process through this person I didn't even know who heard me speak, and ultimately was selected for the board seat. Similarly, for my second board seat at Kindred at Home, I contacted an acquaintance whom I had met through some other board work, and he recommended me to the board chair, and the process then started, and I was privileged to be selected for that board as well. So you don't know who you might meet, and you don't know who's watching. But in my experience, the networking was very effective as compared to the kind of traditional going through recruiting services. Now, not to say recruiting services aren't valuable; they certainly are. And a number of my friends have been placed through recruiting services. That just was not my experience.
That's fascinating. What is the overall current status of women on boards in the US? There's a lot of information and literature and research. You have a very keen finger on this pulse. Talk a little bit about that.
It depends on which indices you might be looking at in terms of what's the percentage of women on board. So if you look at the Fortune 500 or the Russell 3000 or the S&P 500, you may see different percentages of women sitting on boards. So just to do a very broad kind of unscientific range, it's typically sort of in the 20 to 25 plus-ish range. Again, there's variation between these different indices. Now, having said that, it's even lower for women of color. There has been a slight increase over previous years for the numbers of women on boards. And some boards are expanding their numbers rather than replacing an existing director or replacing a woman when a director exits. So there's some movement. To put it in perspective in terms of the growth rate, I've seen reports that say if the growth continues at this pace, it'll take half a century to achieve gender parity on U.S. boards. Right. So slow progress, but much more to be done.
What does literature tell us about the necessity? What is the business case for better diversity and more representation on the governing boards of organizations?
There is a lot in the literature about how businesses perform better. And there are different measures for that. Again, a broad sweep here when there are women on boards. Interesting piece is that the ESG movement that is becoming more and more front and center, particularly on governance issues, investors are wanting boards to look more like the consumers that business services, and also wants boards to represent more what the population looks like. So we're 52% of the population and 70% of the consumers. And so investors are now putting some focus on board composition so that the board reflects more what the population looks like and what the consumer looks like.
What are some of the systemic barriers that exist between us? Because so many of those key decision makers are still individuals that are white males and may not have the networks. So what are the barriers that exist between us and making that progress that's so needed?
Believe it or not, there are still reports where companies will say they cannot find qualified women. And that's just not true. There are some terrific organizations, women corporate directors, a group called Direct Women. I am connected to Direct Women. Direct Women every year canvasses the U.S. and they find the top 20 female attorneys who are ready to serve on boards. So they're pre-screened, if you will.
Wow.
And so there are armies of qualified women considered to be, quote unquote, board ready through professional associations. So hearing comments that it's hard to find qualified women, I don't understand that, because a quick Google search would really help show otherwise. That's part of it. The other part is just a culture of an organization as well, which could be one of the barriers.
Indeed. What about quotas? We hear it in mainstream media. I will admit I haven't done a lot of reading about this space, but I know that there are some new movements for states to mandate gender quotas. What does that look like? Talk us through that, Christine.
Sure. Europe has been setting mandatory gender quotas for years. Norway had the first one in 2003, so we're a little bit behind in terms of quotas. California was the first state in the U.S. to adopt mandatory gender quotas. They did that in 2018. The mandate sets requirements for the numbers of women on boards by certain dates, depending on the board size. There are financial penalties for noncompliance. About 200 of the approximate 800 public companies in California had women already on their boards at the time the law passed. The question is, what's going on currently? Since the law passed in 2018, reports aren't due until the end of the company's fiscal year, so it's a little hard to know with certainty what might be going on exactly. But one report said that there's probably about 90% compliance.
Wow.
So far. Again, the financial penalties can be quite steep, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Massachusetts and New Jersey are introducing similar proposals, so we may actually see more of this going through the country. Now, at the same time, lawsuits have been filed in California. One of the lawsuits claims that the law is unconstitutional and in violation of the equal protection law, because the suit claims that it discriminates on the basis of sex. And those lawsuits are working their way through the courts with no determination yet. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. There are really two minds around the quotas. Again, as I mentioned, there are thousands of women who are board ready through professional associations and in corporations as well. It's good for business. Too bad that business is taking a while to figure that out. And again, as I mentioned with ESG, investors are requiring more diverse boards. And one of the things that I wonder about, and I experience from my personal experience as well, is, are the searches too narrow? So, for example, I would get calls for boards, and the call would say, well, we're looking for a real estate expert, or we're looking for a marketing expert, or we're looking for a technology expert. One wonders if the search is too narrow. And should there be increased flexibility in what boards are looking for? Not to say there aren't women in technology or marketing or real estate. That's not the point. It's getting diversity of thought, not only diversity in terms of gender and certainly in terms of ethnicity, but more diversity of thought, people who perhaps can play sort of the entire field on a board rather than we want this narrow expertise. So that's one question. So there are qualified women. That's, without a quota, you could find qualified women. Now, with a quota, is it possible that women might be seen as tokens and perceived as less qualified? Or we put a woman on the board just because we had to. Barron's reports that in some situations, stock prices drop in anticipation of women directors being appointed because there's concern that they will be less qualified because they have less experience. So the quotas can cut both ways. It can increase the number of women on boards, and will, certainly in California, and has. But at the same time, what might that perception be if women are placed merely because of numbers? So it really cuts both ways.
Let's transition just a little bit, because there are many obstacles that exist for women in the workplace. You've been speaking for years on gender equity. What are the things that still get in the way of women wanting to advance regardless of their profession? If it's in law, if it's in medicine, if it's in engineering or academia?
I view this as sort of two different types of obstacles. One is an institutional or cultural obstacle that keeps women from progressing in the workplace. Many organizations with good intentions have policies that just don't match reality. So, for example, when I was working in the law firm, one of my friends was pregnant with her first child. She wanted to come back after the child was born and after her maternity leave, and she did. And there was a policy for part-time work. So she wanted to use that policy for her post-maternity return. She was now working 50 to 60 hours a week. So if that's what part-time looks like, that doesn't seem to work so well. So again, I think the policy was very well intentioned, but that was not the reality. And my colleague actually left the firm. So policies don't always equal reality. There have also been some studies where what I'll say is executives talk a really good game. Now, this is around culture. In 2017, McKinsey had a study. 75% of CEOs included gender equity in the top 10 business priorities. But then when you went and looked at results, gender outcomes still were not changing. And stereotypes are also alive and well. A very interesting study a few years ago for STEM women, science, technology, engineering, and math. So I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, but 48% of Black women, 47% of Hispanic women, and 32% of white women were mistaken for administrative staff or custodial staff.
Mm-hmm.
So there's still work to be done on stereotypes. And then finally, women get put behind pretty early in that it's hard for them to get representation at every level because it starts early in the pipeline with missing the first step to manager. 100 men are promoted to manager positions for every 72 women. And then the result is there's only 38% women in management, and it continues to decrease at every level, and women in general never catch up. So not only do they not catch up in terms of position, they also do not catch up in terms of salary. So there's a hindrance way early at the front end in the pipeline. So those are some of the high-level institutional issues. Now, personal issues.
Yeah, that's exactly where I wanted to go next. What do we perhaps individually do or personally do that gets in our own way?
Sometimes we are trying to be too perfect. Studies show that women will apply for a job when they feel they check every box on the job application, when they're 100% ready. Men apply when they're 60% ready. So that's one thing that we do that holds us back. And one of the results is men get advanced on, potential, and women get advanced on performance. So we need to be thinking about taking ourselves out of the comfort zone and applying when we know we can do this job, even if we don't check every single box on the job description. Another place where there are studies that show women have fewer networks than men. So what can one do about that? Well, include the other 50%, include the men. Men can be tremendous allies, and many times, in general, want to be allies. So it's not just about having a female network, it's about having a broad network, both inside your organization and outside the organization. There are few, if any, executive role models, female role models for women in many organizations. So expand that and include the men. Mentorship and sponsorship also very important for women and particularly young people coming up through their industry in general. I split the two. I split mentorship and sponsorship. I have some colleagues who put them together. My preference is to leave them separately, and here's why. Mentorship is someone who will talk with you. I advise my mentees, and I'm so fortunate to have these incredible women who are both still in graduate school and now in management positions. Identify the gap you want to fill in your skills, and then find those mentors who can help you fill that gap. One mentor typically cannot do it all, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a woman. So more than one mentor, men and women, but first your job is to identify the skills gap you want to fill, and then find those mentors. Now, on the sponsorship side, sponsors aren't people who talk with you. They are people who talk about you. You want someone in the room table banging for you, for your raise, for your promotion, for that high visibility project. You want that person in the room advocating for you because you will not be there. And most helpful sponsors I've found are ones who are influencers, who are well respected and well positioned in the company, someone that others listen to. So mentorship I see as sort of one track, and sponsorship as another. And then creating opportunities. Now, many times we sit and wait for something to be created for us, and then we'll respond to us. There are ways you can create your own opportunities. When women particularly see an issue or a problem in their organization that is not being addressed, and they know they have the skills to address it, make the proposal that you should do it. The change, ambiguity, risk are the new norms, so get out of your comfort zone and advocate for yourself, again, within the culture of the organization, within whatever is appropriate for that organization. But you don't necessarily always need to sit and wait for the opportunity to come to you. You can create your own opportunity. And finally, how we show up. There are so many articles in the literature about women don't have confidence and sort of stories like that. I don't believe it. We do have confidence. We just don't brag about it as much as the boys might. So how we show up matters. Even how one walks into a room, the position one takes around a conference table, how we show up physically and how we show up capability-wise matters. I have experienced, as I know a number of other women have, the more competent, and this is actually documented in the literature, the more competent one is perceived to being, they are also perceived to being less nice. So if you're competent, you're considered not nice. If you're less competent, you're considered nice. And when one has a laser focus on results, which is a leader's job, that is sometimes seen as a masculine trait, going back to stereotypes. But how we show up matters. And we need to show our confidence, again, without doing it, I believe, in an offensive or inappropriate way. But we're as confident as the men. We just don't necessarily show up that way.
Yeah, because there is a negative penalty stroke. There is a double bind for women when we show up as strong and confident and capable. We are often viewed negatively by others, whereas that is deemed a positive attribute or characteristic for our male counterparts. But for each of us to identify and nurture and then own our authentic leadership style is incredibly crucial. And I think as I'm listening to you speak, so many things are rolling around in my mind. I want to issue a call to action to all of the amazing men who listen to this podcast to say, if you are mentoring women in your institution, in your profession, first, thank you. Second, make sure that you're challenging them. Because like you said, Christine, that literature that demonstrates that women will wait until we have fulfilled every single criteria for an advancement or a stretch assignment or an opportunity is holding us back. And so we need to do better. But those men who are mentoring women, hold them accountable, encourage them, exhort them to challenge themselves and take those, because that action might not come naturally. They might not be seeing that in others around them. But I guarantee if a male mentor is encouraging that, we will see acceleration that is much needed. And then as we look at our networks, like you said, it's in Sally Hegelstad's books where she talks about how women will prioritize their performance in their role, their job, ahead of career. And I think while both are, of course, important, it is crucial that we don't just focus on doing a good job, but that we're doing a good job and building competence and credibility while we're also attending to our career. What's next? That next step, that next opportunity for board service or professional association involvement or leadership, et cetera, so that we can continue to invest in the network development that will facilitate our achieving those opportunities to move to another institution, to step up a rung or two on our career ladder, or to be sought out for roles that will advance us and allow us to contribute our expertise where a need arises.
On the mentorship part for men mentoring women, I have colleagues who, David Smith and Brad Johnson, who wrote a really interesting book called Athena Rising, How and Why Men Should Mentor Women.
Yes, Brad was just on the podcast recently, so he's terrific. And I love both of their work.
Yeah, I had the privilege to, when their book came out, I had the privilege to interview them at a Men as Allies conference at Dartmouth. And interesting, Me Too had just started to really rise around this time. Now some of the articles that were coming out said that after Me Too, men were hesitant to mentor women just because of the whole Me Too movement, and what if someone accuses me and I didn't do anything? They completely debunk that approach and said, look guys, she's just not into you. So they were worried about, well, what if she's attracted to me? And Dave and Brad said, no, she's looking for a mentor. She's not into you. So just stop. Just stop it already. So that's one thing. So there has been a decrease in men wanting to mentor women following Me Too, and Brad and David addressed that head on. The second part about networking, and you were talking, Laurie, about promotions, and one of the things that is pretty common is in terms of promotions. Many times it's the operational roles that get promoted. So the COO, the CFO, the CIO, the CTO, and the staff roles, which typically are filled by women, are ones that usually don't work up that same promotional ladder. So when you're thinking about moving up within your organization and also getting yourself positioned for a board seat, having those operational roles puts you much more highly placed on the radar, potentially than one of the staff roles. And we have a tendency to fill a lot of staff roles.
Yes. Well, this is fascinating. Christine, thank you so much for coming back to share. I appreciate your leadership in this space and everything that you're doing to advance research and knowledge and preparedness for women. You're leading by example and you're doing it yourself, but you're turning around and equipping so many others to do it behind you. And I admire and respect and appreciate that so deeply.
Thank you. I was blessed to have a number of very strong advocate male mentors and sponsors. So I've been very blessed by that. If I could just share 2 quotes for women before we close.
Yes.
One is from Alice Walker, and she said, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And I can't tell you how many young women I talk to who believe they really don't have any power, and they do. So for the young women, and even not necessarily new graduates, for all women listening, we have power. We have power. We need to be smart about how we use it. And for the men listening, please recognize the women's power because they have it. That's one. And the second is from Eleanor Roosevelt. She said, for women in politics and public office, and I would expand that to just working women in general, women need to grow skin as thick as rhinoceros hide. And from that, it was, we can grow from criticism. We can grow from really constructive feedback. And sometimes the challenge for us is not taking it personally, but just really using it as a growth opportunity. And yes, sometimes we do need to have skin as thick as rhinoceros hide for a number of reasons, particularly women in leadership. Laurie, you were talking about how women leaders sometimes have a more challenging time than men. Yes, when you're a strong women leader, you might be called political or untrustworthy or in it for yourself, self-serving. Men don't get called that. They're told that they're assertive and powerful and firm. Mm-hmm. So we can grow from personal feedback. We can not take it personally. And it's a great opportunity, to the title of your podcast, Laurie, to continue our growth edge.
Indeed. Well, this is brilliant. How can listeners, if they are wanting to follow you on social media or be in touch with you, to follow your work or find ways to collaborate with you, how can they find you, Christine?
They can find me on LinkedIn. They can find me at Twitter at CJ Spadafor. And they can find me on my website at christinespadafor.com.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. Keep up the remarkable work.
Thanks for listening to the Growth Edge Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with others. Have a great week.